The pristine beaches of North Sentinel Island had remained untouched by outsiders for centuries. The indigenous Sentinelese people fiercely protected their isolation, turning away or killing anyone who dared approach their forbidden shores. So when fishermen spotted a lone figure wading through the surf, speaking fluent English and begging to contact the outside scientists, the world took notice. Dr. Chen, a marine biologist specializing in deep ocean anomalies, was among the first to interview the man who called himself Kael. What he told her defied everything she knew about his isolated tribe. He spoke of advanced technology hidden beneath their island, of ancient guardians who had protected Earth for millennia, and of something vast and hungry stirring in the deepest ocean trenches. But Kael harbored a secret that would shake the foundations of human history. He wasn't just a Sentinelese tribesman, he was the last keeper of knowledge that predated recorded civilization, and according to him, humanity had less than 30 days before an extinction-level threat emerged from the depths. Could an isolated tribe really hold the key to saving our planet, or was this elaborate deception hiding something far more sinister? The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Sarah adjusted her headset, peering down at the Indian Ocean's restless waters. 3 days had passed since Kael's emergence, and she still couldn't reconcile what she'd witnessed with everything she knew about anthropology and marine science. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "I'm a scientist. Skepticism is part of my job description. Your people have had no contact with the outside world for thousands of years, yet you speak English like you have a PhD in linguistics." "My people aren't what the world believes them to be." Kael's dark eyes met hers, and Sarah felt an involuntary chill. The arrows and hostility toward outsiders, that's real enough. But it's protective theater, designed to keep your civilization from discovering what lies beneath our island, which is a monitoring station, one of 12 positioned around the globe to watch for signs of their awakening. Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar tension of a brewing headache. "Them? The ancient threat you mentioned? You're talking about some kind of prehistoric species? That's impossible. We have fossil evidence of the asteroid impact." "You have evidence of the cover-up." Kael's voice carried a weight that made Sarah's arguments die in her throat. "My ancestors, along with 11 other guardian bloodlines, were tasked with ensuring they never woke again. We've maintained the watch for millennia, passing down the knowledge and technology needed to detect the early warning signs." The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. "Approaching the coordinates now. I'm seeing some unusual activity on the surface." Sarah looked out the window and gasped. Below them, the normally deep blue waters had taken on an sickly phosphorescent green hue. The ocean's surface bubbled and churned as if something massive was stirring far beneath. "How long has it been like this?" she asked the pilot. "Started 3 days ago. Same day our friend here showed up." Kael was already unbuckling his harness. "We need to take water samples immediately. If the bioluminescent bacteria are this active at the surface, it means the deep thermal vents are beginning to destabilize." Kael's expression softened slightly. "The huts are camouflaged, Dr. Chen. Beneath our island is a facility that makes your most advanced research stations look primitive. We've been monitoring deep ocean activity for 3,000 years. As the helicopter began its descent toward the glowing waters, Sarah felt her worldview cracking apart like ice under pressure. Either she was dealing with the most elaborate hoax in history, or everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the world was catastrophically wrong. The water samples would tell her which. But as she watched Kael's face grow increasingly grim while studying the readings, she began to suspect that the truth would be far more terrifying than any deception. The fluorescent lights of the Port Blair Hospital cast everything in a sickly green pallor, making the mysterious man's bronze skin appear almost luminescent. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the observation window, watching as Dr. Reeves attempted another examination. The tribesman, if that's what he truly was, sat motionless on the edge of the bed, his dark eyes tracking every movement in the room with predatory awareness. "His vital signs are completely normal," Dr. Reeves had told her an hour ago, blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, everything's textbook perfect. But there are anomalies. Sarah's tablet displayed the preliminary test results. The man's blood work showed elevated levels of compounds she'd never seen before, complex proteins that shouldn't exist in human physiology. More disturbing were the tissue samples from his minor cuts. The cellular regeneration rate was unprecedented, wounds healing at nearly 3 times the normal speed. Through the intercom, she heard Dr. Reeves speaking softly. "Can you tell me your name?" The man's response came in that same impossibly fluent English, his accent carrying traces of something ancient and indefinable. "Names are constructs of your modern world. I am what I have always been, a guardian, a watcher, a keeper of the deep truths." Sarah's anthropologist colleague, Dr. James Hartwell, shifted beside her. He'd arrived from Delhi that morning, his usual academic composure replaced by barely contained excitement. "Fascinating. The linguistic patterns suggest education at an advanced level, possibly postgraduate. But that's impossible. The Sentinelese have had no contact with the outside world for centuries." "Has had no contact," Sarah corrected absently, though her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about yesterday's readings from her deep-sea monitoring stations scattered across the Andaman Sea. 3 separate sensors had detected the same anomaly. Subsonic vibrations emanating from the ocean floor, patterns too regular to be natural seismic activity. Dr. Reeves tried a different approach. "Why did you come here? What made you leave your island?" The man stood abruptly, moving to the window. Even through the glass, Sarah could see the intensity in his gaze as he stared toward the harbor. The sleepers stir in their ancient beds. The deep currents carry their whispers to those who remember how to listen. "Your instruments have felt their stirring. I know this because the sea tells me all things." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. How could he possibly know about her monitoring equipment? "The temperature differential began 3 weeks ago," the man continued, his voice taking on an urgent tone. "Your satellites have recorded the thermal blooms rising from the deepest trenches. Your governments classify these reports, hide them from your people, but the ocean cannot be silenced." Hartwell leaned closer to the intercom. "That information isn't public knowledge. How do you—" "Knowledge flows through channels your science barely recognizes," the man interrupted. "The mycorrhizal networks beneath the waves, the electromagnetic signatures of living coral, the songs of whales carrying data across continents. You have forgotten that consciousness is not confined to individual minds." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she accessed her secure research files. The classified thermal imaging data was exactly as he'd described. Massive heat signatures emerging from oceanic trenches across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The patterns had begun appearing 3 weeks ago, just as he'd said. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. "Listen carefully, Dr. Chen," the man said, turning to look directly at her through the observation window. The use of her name sent ice through her veins. Beneath the Mariana Trench, sleeping giants older than your civilization dream of awakening. They are not of this world, though they have dwelt here longer than humanity has drawn breath. The ancient texts your archaeologists dismiss as mythology, they are warning systems, instructions left by those who faced this threat before. Dr. Reeves glanced toward the observation window, clearly unsettled. "How do you know Dr. Chen's name? How do you know about classified research data?" "Because the deep knows all things, and I am its voice." The man moved closer to the glass separating him from Sarah. "Dr. Chen, your research into bioluminescent communication patterns in deep-sea organisms, you have seen the coordinated responses across species barriers, the synchronized behaviors spanning thousands of miles. You have wondered how simple creatures could organize such complex networks." "They are not simple creatures," the man continued. "They are extensions of a vast consciousness, fragments of minds that predate your species by millions of years. And something is calling them home." The lights in the hospital corridor flickered momentarily. Through the windows, Sarah could see the harbor waters reflecting the afternoon sun, appearing deceptively calm. But beneath that placid surface, if this impossible man was telling the truth, something ancient and vast was beginning to stir. Dr. Hartwell cleared his throat nervously. Assuming for a moment that we believe you, what exactly are you asking us to do? The man's smile held no warmth, only grim determination. Prepare for humanity's oldest nightmare to rise from the deep. Dr. Sarah Chen's hands trembled as she reached for her secure satellite phone. The conversation with the Sentinelese man, who had introduced himself simply as Kael, replayed in her mind like a broken record. Ancient guardians, something stirring in the deep, the ocean remembering. "Marcus, it's Sarah." She kept her voice low, glancing toward the medical tent where Kael rested under heavy sedation. "I need you to run a deep-water sonar sweep of the Andaman Basin. Full spectrum, maximum depth, at 3 in the morning. Sarah, what's? Just do it, please. And Marcus?" She paused, watching the tent flap flutter in the humid breeze. "Don't log it officially. Not yet." The line went quiet, except for the distant hum of the research vessel's engines. Dr. Marcus Webb had been her research partner for 8 years, and she'd never asked him to hide data before. How deep are we talking? All the way down. Challenger deep if you have to. Christ, Sarah. That'll take hours to process. What exactly am I looking for? She closed her eyes, feeling ridiculous. Anomalies. Anything that doesn't belong. After ending the call, Sarah made her way to the small laboratory adjacent to the medical facility. The blood samples she'd drawn from Kael sat in the centrifuge, separated into their component parts. She'd run every test she could think of, genetic markers, toxicology, even exotic pathogen screens. Everything came back normal, more than normal. His cellular structure showed remarkable efficiency, as if optimized by generations of perfect adaptation. But it was the linguistic analysis that truly unsettled her. She'd recorded their entire conversation and run it through advanced speech pattern recognition software. Kael's English wasn't learned from missionaries or anthropologists. The syntactic structures, the phonetic precision, it suggested acquisition through formal education spanning decades. Yet no outsider had successfully contacted the Sentinelese in over a century. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Dr. James Reyes, the expedition's anthropologist, peered through the doorway. His usually composed demeanor had cracked, revealing deep concern. "The translation algorithms finished running," he said, holding a tablet. "Sarah, you need to see this." She followed him to the communications array, where banks of computers processed linguistic data around the clock. Reyes pulled up a series of spectral analyses, visual representations of speech patterns and grammatical structures. "I fed our recording through every database we have, Indo-European, Sino-Tibetan, Austronesian, everything." His finger traced the screen. "Kael's English shows underlying influences from languages that shouldn't exist." "What do you mean?" "Proto-languages, theoretical reconstructions of human speech from 12,000 years ago. But here's the impossible part. He's also using phonetic elements that predate any known human linguistic development. We're talking about sound structures that would require anatomical adaptations our species never developed." Sarah stared at the scrolling data. "You're saying he's not entirely human?" "I'm saying his language suggests contact with linguistic traditions that academic consensus claims never existed. Either our understanding of human development is fundamentally wrong, or—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. A sharp beeping from Sarah's workstation drew them back to the laboratory. The sonar data from Marcus had arrived, processed into 3-dimensional topographical maps of the ocean floor. Sarah opened the files, expecting to find nothing more than familiar deep-sea formations. Instead, she found geometric impossibilities. Buried beneath 4 miles of sediment in the Andaman Basin lay structures that defied natural formation. Perfect angles, symmetrical arrangements spanning hundreds of square miles. The sonar painted shadows of vast corridors, chambers, and what appeared to be a central hub connected to smaller nodes by perfectly straight channels. "That's not geological," Reyes whispered, leaning over her shoulder. Sarah enhanced the resolution, focusing on the central structure. It rose from the ocean floor like a twisted spire, its surface covered in patterns too regular for nature but too organic for any known architecture. And according to the geological dating algorithms, the surrounding sediment layers indicated the structure had been there for at least 10,000 years. Her tablet chimed with an incoming message from Marcus. "Sarah, you need to get back here. We're picking up acoustic anomalies from the deep survey zone. Low frequency, almost subsonic. But here's the weird part. They're rhythmic. Almost like..." The message cut off. Sarah tried calling back, but the satellite connection had died. She rushed outside, scanning the horizon for Marcus's research vessel. Its lights were visible 5 miles northeast, but something was wrong. The ship's normal running lights flickered erratically, and she could see unusual phosphorescence in the water around its hull. Behind her, urgent voices erupted from the medical tent. Sarah spun around to see staff members backing away as Kael emerged, no longer sedated, his eyes wide with terror. "It has begun," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the camp. "The deep current stirs. They know we have spoken." As if summoned by his words, a low vibration rumbled through the water beneath their feet, so deep Sarah felt it in her bones rather than heard it. In the distance, Marcus's ship went completely dark. The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air as Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the window, watching North Sentinel Island grow larger below. The forbidden landmass emerged from the Andaman Sea like a green jewel, its pristine beaches and dense jungle canopy betraying nothing of the mysteries it might hold. Beside her, Dr. James Hartwell adjusted his recording equipment for the 3rd time, his nervous energy filling the cramped cabin. "Remember," Commander Torres shouted over the engine noise, "we maintain a 500-meter perimeter. The Indian government was very clear about that." Sarah nodded, though her attention remained fixed on the island. Somewhere down there, an entire civilization had existed in isolation for 60,000 years, and somehow, impossibly, one of them had learned perfect English and swum 15 miles to warn the outside world of an ancient threat. The pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. "We've got movement on the beach." Sarah grabbed her binoculars, scanning the white sand until she found them. A group of figures standing at the water's edge. Unlike the historical accounts of hostile encounters, these Sentinelese weren't brandishing weapons or shouting. They stood perfectly still, watching the helicopter with an eerie calm that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Are you getting this?" she asked Hartwell, who was already filming through his telephoto lens. "Every second." "But Sarah, look at their positioning." She adjusted her focus. The islanders weren't scattered randomly along the beach. They were arranged in a precise geometric pattern, forming what looked almost like a symbol when viewed from above. At the center of the formation stood a figure taller than the rest, his arm raised not in threat, but in what appeared to be greeting. "That's him," Torres said grimly. "That's got to be our swimmer." The pilot banked left, maintaining their distance while circling the island. Sarah's training told her to document everything systematically, but her instincts screamed that they were witnessing something unprecedented. The Sentinelese below moved with purpose, shifting their formation as the helicopter moved, always maintaining that strange symbolic arrangement. "Commander," the pilot's voice cut through their observations, "I'm picking up some unusual readings on the instruments." "What kind of readings?" "Electromagnetic interference. It's subtle, but it's definitely there. Almost like..." The radio erupted in static. Sarah felt a strange tingling sensation, and the hair on her arms stood up. Below them, the ocean around the island began to change. The normally blue-green water was taking on an odd luminescence, as if lit from beneath. "Are you seeing this?" Hartwell whispered, his camera capturing every second. The glow intensified, spreading outward from the island in concentric rings. Sarah had studied bioluminescence extensively, but this was different. Too bright, too organized, too purposeful. The light pulsed in a rhythm that seemed almost like communication. "We need to get closer," she said. But even as he spoke, the pilot was fighting the controls. "Something's pulling us down. Not mechanically, it's like the air pressure just changed." Sarah watched the altimeter drop steadily. They were still well above the restricted perimeter, but descending fast. Below, the Sentinelese had begun moving toward the jungle edge, their formation dissolving into what looked like practiced evacuation procedures. "Can you compensate?" Torres asked the pilot. "Working on it, but the instruments are going crazy. GPS is showing our location as impossible coordinates. Some of these numbers don't even exist on Earth." The electromagnetic interference grew stronger, and Sarah realized she could hear something beneath the static. A low rhythmic sound that seemed to resonate in her chest. It was hauntingly familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd heard it before. "The deep ocean recordings," she murmured, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Hartwell, this is the same frequency pattern we detected in the Mariana Trench data." "That's impossible." Those recordings were from 7 miles underwater. The helicopter shuddered, and through the interference, they heard the pilot's strained voice. "I've got partial control back, but we need to leave. Now." The electromagnetic interference faded as they gained distance, but the implications of what they'd witnessed grew stronger. The swimmers' warnings about an ancient threat suddenly seemed less like the ravings of a madman and more like an urgent message from people who had been guardians of something terrible for millennia. Torres was already reaching for his satellite phone. "Agreed. But next time, we're bringing more than cameras and good intentions." The research vessel, en Meridian, cut through the choppy waters of the Bay of Bengal, its hull groaning against the swells that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. Sarah stood at the bow, salt spray stinging her face as she watched the impossible sight ahead. North Sentinel Island rising from the ocean like a green jewel, its beaches eerily calm despite the turbulent seas surrounding them. "We're breaking about 50 international laws right now," Captain Morrison called from behind her, his weathered hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. "The Indian Navy's going to have our heads if they catch us within 12 nautical miles." Sarah didn't turn around. Her eyes remained fixed on the island that had haunted her thoughts for the past 3 days, ever since Kael had been transferred to the secure facility in Port Blair. The memory of his final words echoed in her mind. "The awakening has begun." "Look to the water, Dr. Chen. Look to the deep places where the old songs still echo." "The readings are getting stronger," called Dr. James Wu from the sonar station, his usually steady voice betraying a hint of unease. "Whatever's down there, it's massive. And it's moving." Sarah finally turned, crossing the deck to peer over James's shoulder at the display. The sonar painted a picture that defied explanation, a structure beneath the sea floor that stretched for kilometers, its geometry too precise to be natural. But more disturbing were the smaller signatures, dozens of them, circling the massive central form like satellites around a planet. "How deep?" she asked. 2,000 meters below the sea floor. "Sarah, this thing, it's the size of Manhattan." Dr. Elena Vasquez looked up from her tablet, her face pale. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts. We're detecting organized patterns, almost like..." She paused, frowning at the data. "Like what, Elena?" "Like a transmission, a signal of some kind, broadcasting on frequencies we've never encountered before." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean spray. She thought of Kael's impossible knowledge, his perfect English learned from sources he couldn't possibly have accessed. What if he wasn't lying about any of it? A sharp crack echoed across the water, and everyone turned toward the island. A section of the beach that had been empty moments before now showed movement, figures emerging from the tree line. Even at this distance, Sarah could make out their distinctive silhouettes, the Sentinelese people whose isolation had remained unbroken for thousands of years. "They see us," Morrison muttered, reaching for the radio. "We need to get out of here before..." "Wait." Sarah grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Through the binoculars, she could see something that made her heart race. The figures on the beach weren't moving with the aggressive posture she'd expected. Instead, they stood in perfect formation, facing the water, their arms raised skyward in what could only be described as supplication. "They're praying?" James whispered, looking through his own set of binoculars. The water around the meridian began to change. What had been deep blue darkened to an almost black green, and phosphorescent patterns started to swirl beneath the surface. Sarah had seen bioluminescence before, but nothing like this. The lights moved with purpose, forming intricate spirals that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the electromagnetic readings Elena was monitoring. "Sarah," Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "The signal, it's responding to our presence. The patterns are changing, adapting." A low vibration thrummed through the ship's hull, so deep it was felt more than heard. In the water, the phosphorescent display intensified, and Sarah could swear she saw shapes moving within the lights, vast forms that suggested tentacles or appendages of impossible size. On the beach, the Sentinelese had begun to chant. The sound carried across the water despite the distance, a harmonious vocalization that seemed older than language itself. Sarah realized with growing horror that she recognized some of the tonal patterns. They matched fragments of the recordings Kael had made during his interviews. "Captain, we need to leave. Now." But even as she said it, Sarah found herself transfixed by what she was witnessing, the convergence of impossible elements, the ancient structure beneath the sea floor, the responding lights in the water, the ritual being performed by people who should have no knowledge of either, painted a picture that her scientific mind rejected, even as her instinct screamed its truth. The chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly the water around them erupted, not with violence but with light, brilliant alien illumination that turned the ocean surface into a mirror of the night sky. For a moment that felt like eternity, Sarah saw them clearly, massive forms ascending from the depths, their geometries wrong in ways that hurt to perceive directly. Then, as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The lights faded, the water returned to normal, and the Sentinelese figures melted back into the jungle as if they had never been there at all. In the sudden silence, Elena's voice cracked like a whip across the deck. "Sarah, we just lost contact with Port Blair. All communication frequencies are dead." The emergency beacon aboard the research vessel in Meridian cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a mechanical scream. Sarah jolted awake in her narrow bunk, her heart hammering against her ribs as the crimson strobe painted her cabin walls in violent flashes. The ship's automated voice crackled through the intercom, "All hands to stations. Sonar anomaly detected." "This is not a drill." She dressed quickly, her mind still processing the events of the previous evening. Kael's warnings about the ancient guardians beneath the waves had seemed almost mythical in the lamplight of her cabin. But now, with alarms blaring and the ship vibrating with urgent activity, his words carried a different weight entirely. The bridge was chaos when she arrived. Captain Morrison stood hunched over the sonar display, his weathered face pale in the green glow of the screen. Lieutenant Hayes worked frantically at her station, fingers flying over controls as data streams cascaded across multiple monitors. "What do we have?" Sarah asked, moving to Morrison's side. "Massive displacement on the ocean floor," Morrison replied without looking up. Something the size of a city block just moved. 12,000 feet down, Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Geological activity? Underwater landslide? "That's what I thought initially." Hayes swiveled in her chair, her young face tight with confusion. "But the seismic patterns are all wrong. Look at this." The sonar display showed a three-dimensional representation of the ocean floor. Where yesterday there had been a relatively flat abyssal plain, now a massive structure protruded upward, its edges too geometric, too precise to be natural. "How long has it been rising?" Sarah asked. "Started approximately 6 hours ago," Hayes replied. "But here's the thing, it's not just rising, it's unfolding." The word sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She thought of Kael's description of the Guardian's awakening, of ancient mechanisms stirring to life after millennia of slumber. "Where's Kael?" "Forward observation deck," Morrison said. "Been standing there since the alarm started, like he was expecting this." Sarah found him exactly where Morrison had indicated, silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. The wind whipped his dark hair as he stared out at the seemingly empty ocean, but his posture suggested he was seeing something the rest of them couldn't. "You knew this would happen," she said, approaching carefully. "The first guardian stirs," he replied without turning. "The ocean remembers, even if humanity has forgotten." "Guardian?" Sarah moved to stand beside him. "That thing on the sonar, what is it exactly?" Kael's hands gripped the railing, his knuckles white. "Your people would call it a machine, but that word carries limitations your language cannot overcome. It is alive in ways your science doesn't recognize, alive and ancient and very, very angry." The ship shuddered suddenly, a vibration that seemed to come from the water itself rather than the engines. Sarah grabbed the railing as the Meridian pitched to starboard, then righted itself with mechanical groans of protest. "Jesus Christ!" Morrison's voice crackled through the comm system. "Sarah, you need to see this. Now." They rushed back to the bridge, where the sonar display had transformed into something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. The structure below was no longer just rising, it was actively reconfiguring itself, segments rotating and extending like the petals of some impossible flower blooming in the abyssal depths. "Energy readings are off the charts," Hayes reported, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Whatever that thing is, it's generating its own power source, something we've never seen before." "Bioluminescence?" Sarah suggested, though even as she said it, she knew it was inadequate. "No," Kael said from behind them. "Life force. The Guardians don't just use energy, they embody it. They are convergence points, where the ocean's consciousness manifests in physical form." Morrison turned to stare at him. "Ocean's consciousness? What the hell does that mean?" Before Kael could answer, the water around the ship began to glow, not the familiar blue-green phosphorescence Sarah knew from her years of marine research, but something deeper, more purposeful. Tendrils of light snaked through the dark water like neural pathways firing in some vast aquatic brain. "It's communicating," Kael whispered, his face suddenly grave. "The Guardian is trying to interface with the ocean's memory banks, searching for the source of the disturbance." "What disturbance?" Sarah demanded. "The one that awakened it." Kael turned to face her, and she saw fear in his eyes for the first time since he'd emerged from the impossible waters of North Sentinel Island. "Something has damaged the deep places, Dr. Chen. Something your people have done. And now the Guardians are waking up to investigate." The ship shuddered again, more violently this time, and Sarah realized with growing dread that they weren't just observing this phenomenon, they were caught in the middle of it. The laboratory fell silent, except for the hum of equipment and the distant crash of waves against the research station's hull. Dr. Sarah Chen stared at the sonar readings spread across her monitor, each pulse revealing something that shouldn't exist, geometric patterns carved into the ocean floor, too precise to be natural, too vast to comprehend. Kael stood behind her, his presence both comforting and unsettling. For someone who claimed to have lived his entire life on an isolated island, he navigated the high-tech environment with disturbing ease. "The formations extend for miles," Sarah whispered, adjusting the sonar parameters. "These can't be geological features." "They are not," Kael confirmed, his voice carrying that strange weight of certainty. "What you see are the remains of the first cities. The architects built them when the oceans were shallow, before the Great Melt." Sarah's fingers paused over the keyboard. "The Great Melt happened 12,000 years ago. Human civilization wasn't—" "Your history is incomplete." Kael moved closer, pointing to a cluster of structures on the screen. "Here." This was a processing facility. They harvested energy from the planet's core, channeled it through crystalline matrices. He traced a line connecting several points. The network spans every ocean. Most facilities remain dormant, but something is reactivating them. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If Kael was right, everything she understood about human development was wrong. But the evidence stared back at her from the screen. Structures that defied explanation, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. "Dr. Chen?" Marcus Torres's voice crackled through the comm system. "We're picking up some unusual electromagnetic signatures. You might want to see this." Sarah saved the sonar data and hurried to the communications bay, Kael following silently. Torres hunched over a bank of monitoring equipment, his face pale in the blue glow of the displays. "Started about 20 minutes ago," he said, not looking up. "Low-frequency pulses, but they're not random. There's a pattern, almost like a heartbeat," Kael finished. "It has begun." Torres spun around, startled. In the chaos of the previous hours, he hadn't been formally introduced to their unexpected guest. "Who the hell?" "This is Kael," Sarah interrupted. "He's the one who warned us about the threat." She studied the electromagnetic readings, noting the rhythmic pulses. "What exactly has begun?" "A failsafe." Torres looked between them in confusion. "What kind of failsafe?" Before Kael could answer, the station shuddered. Emergency lights flickered on as the normal illumination died. Through the porthole, Sarah saw something that made her breath catch. A phosphorescent glow rising from the depths, pulsing in rhythm with the electromagnetic signals. "All hands to emergency stations," Captain Morrison's voice boomed through the intercom. "We've got massive displacement readings from below. Something big is moving down there." Sarah rushed to the observation deck, her scientific training warring with primal fear. The ocean around the research station had begun to churn, great bubbles rising from the depths. The phosphorescent glow grew brighter, and she could make out a vast shape ascending through the darkness. Something impossibly large and geometrically complex. "The Guardian awakens," Kael said quietly, joining her at the observation window. "It has slept for millennia, waiting for the signs." "What signs?" Sarah demanded, though part of her already knew the answer. "Climate change, ocean acidification, the planet's electromagnetic field weakening." Kael's voice carried a note of sadness, the same conditions that preceded the architect's fall. The Guardian was programmed to activate when these thresholds were reached. The shape below them continued to rise, and Sarah could see it wasn't a creature at all. It was a structure, a massive construction of metal and crystal that pulsed with internal light. Small objects detached from its surface, ascending like mechanical spawn. "Is it hostile?" Torres asked, his voice tight with fear. Kael considered the question. "It is protective. The Guardian's purpose is to preserve the planet's biosphere, even if that means eliminating threats to it." "Threats like us," Sarah realized with growing horror. "Potentially, yes. The architects faced the same choice your species faces now, evolve or perish. They chose poorly, became too dependent on their technology, lost touch with the natural world. When the Guardian judged them unworthy, it withdrew its protection." The research station shook again as the massive structure breached the surface. Water cascaded from its alien geometries, revealing symbols that hurt to look at directly. The smaller objects, drones or probes, spread out across the ocean's surface, their purpose unknown but clearly purposeful. "How do we communicate with it?" Sarah asked desperately. "How do we prove we're worth saving?" Kael turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting the strange light from below. "That is why I came. My people have maintained the old knowledge, the ways of speaking to the Guardian, but the choice is not mine to make, it is yours. Humanity must decide what it is willing to sacrifice for survival." The submersible, a deep echo, descended through the midnight zone, its hull creaking against the mounting pressure. Sarah watched the depth gauge climb, 3,000 meters and still falling. Outside the reinforced porthole, bioluminescent creatures drifted past like alien ghosts, their brief flashes the only light in a world of absolute darkness. "Sonar's picking up something massive directly below us," Captain Torres announced from the pilot's seat, his weathered hands steady on the controls. Whatever it is, it's big enough to have its own gravitational signature. Sarah leaned forward, studying the readouts. The anomaly stretched across several square kilometers of ocean floor, far larger than any known geological formation in this region. How deep are we going? According to your tribal friend's coordinates, we stop at 4,000 meters. But Sarah... Torres paused, pointing at another instrument. The water temperature down here is all wrong. It's actually getting warmer as we descend. Behind them, Dr. James Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his restraints. The geneticist had insisted on joining the expedition, despite Sarah's protests, claiming his expertise might be crucial. Geothermal vents can explain temperature variations, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Not like this, Torres replied. This heat source is moving. Sarah's tablet chimed with an incoming message from the surface. Director Harrison's face appeared on screen, his expression grim. Sarah, we've lost contact with 2 more research stations in the Pacific. Whatever's happening down there, it's spreading. The transmission cut to static, then died completely. They were alone now, 4,000 meters beneath the surface, following the impossible directions of a man who shouldn't exist. There, Sarah whispered, pointing through the porthole. The submersible's floodlights illuminated a vast structure rising from the abyssal plain. At first glance, it resembled a mountain, but as they drew closer, the geometric precision became undeniable. Massive blocks of black stone, each the size of a city building, fitted together with mathematical perfection. Spiraling pathways wound around towering spires that disappeared into the darkness above. My God, Mitchell breathed. How old is this? Sarah checked her instruments, but the readings made no sense. Carbon dating required samples, and the metal detectors showed compositions that didn't match any known elements. The architecture... I've never seen anything like it. Torres maneuvered the submersible along the structure's perimeter, following what appeared to be a main thoroughfare. Carved symbols covered every surface, their alien geometry seeming to shift and writhe in the submersible's lights. Sarah activated the external cameras, documenting everything, though she wondered if anyone would ever see the footage. Movement, Torres announced, his voice tight. Something's coming up from the deep trenches. The sonar painted a terrifying picture, massive shapes, dozens of them, rising from chasms that plunged beyond their instruments' range. They moved with purpose, converging on the ancient city like a gathering storm. We need to surface, Mitchell said, panic creeping into his voice. This was a mistake. No, Sarah replied firmly. Kael said we'd find answers here. Look at that central spire. There's an opening. Torres guided them toward what appeared to be a docking bay carved into the structure's heart. As they approached, phosphorescent algae coating the walls began to glow, creating an eerie bioluminescent pathway. The submersible settled onto a landing platform that seemed designed for their exact specifications. That's impossible, Torres muttered. This platform, it's the perfect size for our sub. Sarah was already suiting up for external exploration. The pressure suits would allow them 2 hours outside the submersible, enough time to investigate the chamber beyond the docking bay. They were expecting us, she said. Whoever built this knew we'd come. Mitchell grabbed her arm. Sarah, think about what you're saying. An ancient civilization that could predict our arrival? It's madness. So is a Sentinelese tribesman speaking perfect English, she replied, activating her suit's life support systems. So are the ocean temperatures rising by degrees in a matter of days. So are the mass extinctions we're recording across the Pacific. Madness might be the only rational response. Torres was suiting up as well, leaving Mitchell to monitor the submersible. The external sensors are picking up atmosphere in that chamber, he reported. Breathable atmosphere. How is that possible at this depth? They cycled through the airlock, their magnetic boots clicking against the alien metal of the docking platform. The chamber beyond stretched into cathedral-like vastness, its walls covered in the same shifting symbols they'd seen outside. But it was the central feature that stopped them cold. A perfect sphere of water hung suspended in the chamber's center, defying every law of physics Sarah knew. Within its translucent depths, images flickered, scenes of Earth's ancient past, civilizations that predated human history, and creatures that belonged in nightmares. As they approached, the sphere pulsed with inner light, and Sarah heard something impossible, Kaelin's voice, speaking directly into her mind. "Now you begin to understand," he said. "Now you see what we have awakened." The coordinates led them to a stretch of ocean so unremarkable that Sarah almost questioned whether they'd made a navigation error. The research vessel, en meridian, cut through calm waters under an overcast sky, its engines humming steadily as they approached the location Kael had provided. 43 degrees north, 71 degrees west, roughly 200 nautical miles southeast of Cape Cod, in waters that averaged 3,000 feet deep. "Sonar's picking up something," announced Dr. Marcus Webb, the expedition's marine geologist, his eyes fixed on the glowing display. "Bottom topography doesn't match the charts." Sarah leaned over his shoulder, studying the readings. The seafloor showed unusual formations, geometric patterns too regular to be natural. "How far down?" 2,800 feet. But that's not the strange part. Marcus adjusted the sonar frequency. "These structures, they're massive. We're talking about something the size of a small city down there." Captain Torres approached from the bridge, her weathered face creased with concern. "Dr. Chen, we've got another problem. Coast Guard's been tracking unusual seismic activity in this area for the past 48 hours. Small tremors, but frequent." Kael stood silently at the rail, his dark eyes scanning the water's surface as if he could see through the depths to whatever lay below. He'd been quiet since they'd left port, speaking only when directly addressed, but Sarah noticed how his knuckles whitened as he gripped the metal railing. "The awakening has already begun," he said without turning around. "Can you not feel it?" "The water itself remembers." Dr. James Holbrook, the team's archaeologist, snorted softly. "Poetic, but hardly scientific. We need concrete evidence, not mystical pronouncements." Sarah was about to respond when the ship's hull vibrated with a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound was barely audible, more felt than heard, but it made her teeth ache and sent an inexplicable chill down her spine. What the hell was that? Torres grabbed the nearest support beam as the vibration intensified. Marcus frantically checked his instruments. "Seismic sensors are going crazy. Whatever's down there just activated somehow." The water around the ship began to change. What had been a normal grey-green took on an unusual phosphorescent quality, as if microscopic organisms were responding to some unseen stimulus. Sarah had seen bioluminescence before, but nothing like this. The entire ocean surface for hundreds of yards in every direction pulsed with an eerie blue-white glow. "Lower the ROV," Sarah ordered, her scientific curiosity overriding her growing unease. "I want eyes on whatever's causing this." The remotely operated vehicle splashed into the luminescent water and began its descent. On the monitor, they watched the blue glow fade as the ROV dropped deeper, its lights cutting through the darkness. At 2,000 feet, the camera began picking up debris, but not the kind Sarah expected. "Those look like structures," whispered Dr. Elena Vasquez, the team's marine archaeologist. "Artificial structures." "Impossible," Holbrook breathed. "The age of those formations. If the geological data is correct, they predate human civilization by thousands of years." Kael finally turned from the rail. "My people have guarded this knowledge since the first of your kind learned to make fire. The dwellers beneath built their cities when your ancestors were still afraid of the dark. They slept, but sleep was never meant to be eternal." As if responding to his words, the ROV's camera detected movement in the depths. Something large shifted in the shadows beyond the structure's edge, too large and too purposeful to be any known marine life. "Pull the ROV back," Sarah commanded, but Marcus was already working the controls. "I'm trying, But something's interfering with the signal. The electromagnetic readings down there are off the charts. The camera feed flickered, showing brief, unsettling glimpses of what might have been tentacles or appendages moving with fluid grace around the ancient structures. Then the connection died entirely, leaving them staring at static. The ocean's phosphorescence intensified, and the low humming sound returned, stronger this time. Sarah felt it in her bones, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something primal in her nervous system. "We need to get out of here," Torres said, but her voice was barely audible over the growing hum. "No," Sarah replied, surprised by her own determination. "We need to go down there. This could be the most important discovery in human history." The submersible's hull groaned as they descended past the 2,000-meter mark, its titanium frame protesting against the crushing weight of the Pacific. Sarah watched the depth gauge with growing unease, her scientific mind warring with the impossible evidence mounting around them. Beside her, Kael sat motionless, his dark eyes fixed on the porthole where bioluminescent creatures drifted like fallen stars through the eternal night. "There," he said quietly, pointing into the abyss. "The threshold." Dr. Martinez leaned forward from the pilot's seat, adjusting the external lights. What emerged from the darkness defied every principle of marine geology Sarah had ever learned. A perfectly circular depression stretched across the ocean floor, its edges carved with mathematical precision that nature simply didn't produce. The formation had to be at least a kilometer in diameter, and as their lights swept across its surface, geometric patterns became visible, intricate designs that seemed to pulse with their own faint luminescence. "My God," Sarah whispered. "How is this possible? The tectonic surveys, the deep-sea mapping projects, something this massive should have been discovered decades ago." "Your instruments cannot detect what doesn't wish to be found," Kael replied. "The Guardian's technology transcends your understanding of physics. They built this place to remain hidden until the time of awakening." Commander Hayes, monitoring their communications from the surface vessel, crackled through the radio. "Dr. Chen, I'm seeing some unusual readings on our sonar. The water temperature down there is spiking, and we're detecting electromagnetic anomalies that shouldn't exist at that depth." Sarah checked their instruments, her stomach dropping as she confirmed Hayes's report. The water temperature had risen 15 degrees in the past 5 minutes, and their compass was spinning wildly. More disturbing still, their depth sonar was showing conflicting readings, as if the ocean floor itself was shifting beneath them. "Set us down on the rim," Kael instructed Martinez. "But be prepared to ascend quickly. If the sleepers stir, this place will become a tomb." As the submersible touched down on the strange crystalline surface, Sarah could see that what she'd initially mistaken for bioluminescence was actually energy coursing through veins in the seafloor itself. The patterns weren't carved. They were alive, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat. "The samples," Sarah said, reaching for the collection arm controls. "If I can just get a piece of this material for analysis." Kael's hand closed over hers with surprising gentleness. "To disturb the threshold now would be to announce our presence. Look closer. See what lies beneath." Sarah adjusted the external camera angle, peering down into the circular depression. At first, she saw only darkness. Then, as her eyes adjusted, shapes began to resolve in the depths, massive architectural forms that stretched down farther than their lights could penetrate. What she was seeing was impossible, a city or the ruins of one, buried beneath 3 kilometers of ocean and geological sediment that should have taken millions of years to accumulate. "The first colony," Kael said, his voice heavy with reverence and fear. "Built when your species was still learning to make fire. The Guardians came from the deep places between stars, fleeing something that devoured worlds. They tried to make Earth their sanctuary, but the things that hunt them are patient. They waited, and now they come." A tremor ran through the submersible, and Sarah watched in horror as one of the massive structures below them shifted, ancient metal groaning as something immense stirred within. The bioluminescent patterns on the seafloor brightened, pulsing faster now, and she could swear she heard a sound through the hull, a low, resonant hum that seemed to bypass her ears and vibrate directly in her bones. "We need to leave," Martinez said, his hands already moving over the ballast controls. "Whatever's down there, it's waking up." "Wait," Sarah said, transfixed by what she was seeing. "Look at the structure on the left. There's an opening, and something's moving inside." Through the porthole, she caught a glimpse of something that would haunt her dreams for years to come. A serpentine form, easily 100 meters long, uncoiled from the depths of the ancient city. Its flesh was translucent, revealing internal organs that pulsed with the same ethereal light as the seafloor, and along its length she could see what looked like sensory organs. Hundreds of eyes that reflected their submersibles' lights with malevolent intelligence. "The Devourer's vanguard," Kael breathed. "They've found us." The creature's massive head turned toward them, and Sarah felt her sanity strain as she looked into alien eyes that held the cold intelligence of something that had traveled between stars. It began to rise, moving with impossible grace through the water, and she realized with crystalline clarity that everything Kael had told them was true. Humanity wasn't alone in the universe, and they were most definitely not the apex predators they'd always believed themselves to be. The submersible Deep Echo descended through layers of crushing darkness, its titanium hull groaning against the immense pressure 3 miles beneath the surface. Sarah pressed her face to the porthole, watching the bioluminescent creatures drift past like fallen stars in an inverted sky. Beside her, Kael sat motionless, his weathered hands resting on his knees, eyes closed as if listening to something she couldn't hear. "The singing grows stronger," he murmured without opening his eyes. "They know we approach." Dr. Martinez adjusted the sonar readings from the pilot's seat, his face pale in the green glow of the instruments. "I'm picking up massive structures ahead. Whatever's down there, it's big, bigger than anything in the archaeological record." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. The past 72 hours had shattered everything she thought she knew about the world. The emergency meeting with the UN Security Council had been a nightmare of disbelief and paranoia. Half the delegates thought Kael was an elaborate hoax, the other half wanted him dissected in a laboratory. Only the mounting evidence, the seismic anomalies, the mass marine die-offs, the reports of impossible creatures surfacing in deep ocean trenches, had convinced them to authorize this mission. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Through the submersible's forward lights, massive stone structures emerged from the abyssal plain like the bones of some titanic beast. Pyramids and spires twisted upward in geometries that hurt to look at, their surfaces covered in the same bioluminescent script she'd seen on Kael's skin during his transformation. But these weren't ruins. They pulsed with active light, as if the city itself were breathing. "My God," Martinez whispered. "The radiometric dating we're getting. Sarah, these structures are over 200,000 years old. They predate modern humans by millennia." Kael's eyes snapped open, pupils dilated to black pools. "Your science measures time poorly. This city was old when the first true humans drew breath. The architects built it as a prison, not a home. Something moved in the shadows between the structures, something vast and serpentine that made the submersible feel like a mote of dust." Sarah's equipment registered electromagnetic anomalies that shouldn't exist at these depths, patterns that suggested organized intelligence rather than natural phenomena. "The Leviathan stirs," Kael said, his voice taking on that otherworldly harmonic quality. "It has sensed our presence. We must reach the resonance chamber before—" The submersible lurched violently to one side, throwing Sarah against the bulkhead. Through the porthole she glimpsed something that defied comprehension, a tendril the size of a subway train, covered in scales that shifted through impossible colors. Where it touched the ocean floor, the sediment began to writhe and coalesce into geometric patterns. "That's not possible," Martinez gasped, fighting to regain control of their descent. Nothing that large could survive at these pressures. The square cube law alone— "Your laws don't apply to the architect's creations," Kael interrupted. "They reshaped matter itself, bound consciousness to flesh in ways your species has forgotten. The Leviathan is not merely alive, it is awareness given form, hunger made manifest." Sarah watched in horrified fascination as smaller creatures emerged from crevices in the ancient structures, things that might once have been human, but were now something else entirely. They moved with purpose, tending to devices that hummed with eldritch energy, their elongated limbs adapted for the crushing depths. "The transformed ones," Kael explained, noting her stare, "those who heard the deep song and answered its call. They have served as guardians for millennia, keeping the seals intact. But the barriers weaken with each passing generation." The submersible's communications array crackled to life, filled with static and something else. A sound like whale song filtered through broken glass and digital distortion. Sarah's neural implant, designed to interface with marine research equipment, began to ache with feedback. "Turn it off," she gasped, clutching her head. "Whatever that signal is, it's trying to establish a connection with my implant." But it was too late. Images flooded her mind, cities beneath every ocean, connected by a vast network of consciousness that spanned the globe. She saw the truth of humanity's origin, not evolution from apes, but genetic manipulation by beings whose technology was indistinguishable from magic. Earth wasn't humanity's birth world, it was their laboratory. "The awakening cannot be stopped," Kael said, his form beginning to shimmer as the pressure and proximity to the ancient city triggered his transformation. "But it can be guided. The choice is before you, Dr. Chen. Will you help me reach the resonance chamber, or will you watch your species face the deep ones unprepared?" Through the porthole, the Leviathan's massive eye appeared, an organ larger than their entire submersible, filled with alien intelligence and hunger that had been building for thousands of years. It regarded them with the patience of geological time, waiting for the seals to finally break and release it upon an unsuspecting world above. The submarine's hull groaned under the pressure as they descended past the 2,000-meter mark. Sarah gripped the armrest of her chair, watching the depth gauge climb with mounting dread. Outside the porthole, bioluminescent creatures drifted like fallen stars in an alien sky. "Contact bearing 270, Lieutenant Rodriguez called from the sonar station. Multiple large objects, approximately 4,000 meters ahead." Captain Morrison leaned over the navigation console. "What kind of objects?" "Unknown, sir. They're geometric, too regular to be natural formations." Kael moved to the porthole beside Sarah, his weathered face reflecting the green glow of the instrument panels. "The sleepers built their cities in the deepest trenches," he said quietly, "places where the weight of the ocean itself would keep them sealed." Sarah felt her scientific skepticism warring with the evidence mounting before her eyes. The sonar readings showed structures that defied explanation, massive pyramidal shapes rising from the abyssal plain, arranged in precise mathematical patterns. "Dr. Chen," Morrison said, "your expertise, what are we looking at?" She studied the sonar display, her mind racing through every geological formation she'd ever encountered. Nothing in nature creates angles that sharp. The symmetry is too perfect, the placement too deliberate. She paused, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "These appear to be artificial structures." The submarine continued its descent, and gradually the first shapes became visible through the murky depths. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Towering spires of black stone rose from the seafloor, their surfaces covered in the same intricate patterns she'd seen carved into Kael's skin. The structures seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic light, like a massive heart beating in the darkness. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered, "how old are these things?" "Older than your civilization's oldest myths," Kael replied. "The Guardians built them as prisons, not monuments." As they drew closer, Sarah could make out more details. The architecture was impossible, surfaces that curved in directions that hurt to look at, angles that seemed to fold in on themselves. Yet there was an undeniable beauty to it, a haunting elegance that spoke of minds vastly different from human consciousness. "Captain!" Rodriguez's voice cracked slightly. "I'm picking up movement." Morrison moved to the sonar station. "Where?" "Everywhere, sir. The entire city. It's alive." Sarah pressed her face to the porthole and immediately wished she hadn't. Things were moving between the spires, massive writhing shapes that defied description. Tentacles the size of subway cars undulated through the water, while clusters of eyes larger than dinner plates swiveled to track the submarine's approach. "The Leviathans," Kael breathed. "The first children of the Deep Ones. They've been waiting, growing stronger in the darkness." One of the creatures turned toward them, and Sarah found herself staring into intelligence so alien and vast that her mind recoiled. The thing's body stretched beyond the reach of their lights, a living mountain of flesh and fury that had been dreaming in the depths for millennia. "All stop," Morrison ordered. "Cut the engines." The submarine's motors fell silent, leaving them suspended in the crushing darkness. For a moment, the only sound was their own breathing and the faint ping of the sonar. Then the city began to sing. It started as a low vibration that Sarah felt in her bones, a subsonic harmony that seemed to emanate from the structures themselves. The patterns carved into the spires pulsed brighter, and more creatures emerged from hidden crevices and caverns. "They know we're here," Kael said. "The sleepers are awakening." Sarah watched in horrified fascination as the nearest spire began to split open like a blooming flower. From within, something vast and tentacled unfolded itself, rising toward the surface with ponderous grace. The water around it shimmered with bioluminescent trails, and she could see other shapes stirring in the depths below. "How many are there?" she whispered. "Enough," Kael replied grimly. "When they reach the surface, your navies will be helpless against them. They'll reclaim the oceans first, then move inland." Morrison was already barking orders to his crew. "Emergency surface! Maximum ascent rate!" But as the submarine began its desperate climb toward the distant surface, Sarah realized they might already be too late. The creatures were rising with them, moving with impossible speed through the crushing depths. The ancient city pulsed with renewed life, and she could feel something vast and malevolent turning its attention toward the world above. Through the porthole, she saw one of the Leviathans breach the edge of their light cone, its massive form undulating past with casual grace. For a brief moment, clusters of alien eyes fixed on the submarine, and Sarah felt her sanity strain under the weight of that inhuman gaze. Then it was gone, ascending toward the surface with its brethren, carrying with it the promise of humanity's darkest hour. The ancient threat Kael had warned them about was no longer sleeping. It was coming home. The submersible, a deep echo, descended through layers of absolute darkness, its external lights cutting pale swaths through water that hadn't seen sunlight in millennia. Sarah gripped the armrest of her seat as the depth gauge clicked past 4,000 meters, entering the abyssal zone where the ocean floor of the Mariana Trench stretched endlessly below. "Thermal signatures are off the charts down here," Captain Torres muttered from the pilot's seat, his weathered hands steady on the controls despite the tremor in his voice. "Water temperatures climbing fast, should be near freezing at this depth." Sarah watched the sonar paint ghostly shapes in the depths below. What had initially appeared as natural rock formations now revealed geometric patterns too precise for nature. Massive structures emerged from the abyssal plain, towers and pyramids that dwarfed human construction, their surfaces covered in the same bioluminescent symbology that decorated Kael's skin. "Mother of God," Torres whispered, as the external cameras captured the first clear images. "How long has this been down here?" "Since before your species learned to make fire," Kael replied. "The Deep Ones built these cities when the continents were young. My people have guarded the knowledge, waiting for the day they would stir again." The submersible's hull groaned as they descended further, pressure gauges flashing warnings that Torres dismissed with practiced efficiency. Below them, The ancient cities stretched to the limits of their lights, a vast metropolis of impossible architecture where angles seemed to bend in directions that hurt to contemplate. Sarah's scientific mind reeled as she tried to process what she was seeing. The structures showed no signs of construction joints or tool marks. They appeared to have been grown rather than built, their surfaces seamless and organic despite their clearly artificial nature. Phosphorescent veins pulsed through the material like arteries carrying alien blood. As they approached, Sarah could see that the tower's surface was covered in moving patterns, the same symbols from Kael's warnings, but these were shifting and changing, cycling through configurations that made her eyes water. The water around the structure shimmered with unnatural light, and schools of deep-sea creatures circled it in hypnotic spirals. "The fish," Martinez breathed. "Look at their behavior patterns." Sarah followed his gaze and felt her blood chill. The creatures weren't swimming randomly, they were forming patterns, geometric shapes that mirrored the symbols on the tower. Bioluminescent squid pulsed in synchronized flashes, while deep-sea eels wove between them in precise formations. "They're being controlled," she realized. "Something is coordinating them." Kael nodded grimly. "The Deep One's influence spreads. Soon it will reach the surface waters, then the shores. Your coastal cities will be the first to fall." Torres adjusted their position to circle the central spire, the submersible's lights revealing more impossible details. Massive doorways gaped in the tower's sides, portals large enough for creatures Sarah didn't want to imagine. And from within those openings, something was stirring. "Movement!" Torres called out, his voice tight with fear. "Big movement dead ahead." The first tentacle emerged from the tower's base like a seeking finger, easily 50 meters long and thick as a subway tunnel. Its surface was covered in the same phosphorescent symbols, but these were clearly biological, living tissue that glowed with alien intelligence. More tentacles followed, unfurling from hidden chambers as something vast began to emerge from its eons-long slumber. "Back away," Kael commanded urgently. "If it sees us directly, we are lost. Its gaze alone can shatter minds." The sonar showed more movement throughout the city. Other structures were awakening, their occupants stirring after countless millennia. The ocean floor itself seemed to pulse with renewed life as the ancient metropolis came alive around them. "How many are there?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Kael's expression was grim as he watched the city recede below them. "Enough to reclaim what they believe is theirs. The surface world, the seas, everything humanity calls home. They ruled this planet once, before the continents settled. Now they mean to rule it again." As they ascended toward the distant surface, Sarah realized they weren't just racing against time. They were racing against awakening gods. The submersible Lateep Explorer descended through layers of crushing darkness, its hull groaning under the immense pressure of the Mariana Trench. Sarah pressed her face against the porthole, watching the external lights carve weak paths through the abyssal void. Beside her, Kael sat motionless, his dark eyes fixed on something only he could see. "Depth 18,000 feet, announced Captain Rodriguez through the comm. "We're approaching the coordinates you specified." Sarah's instruments registered water temperatures that should have been impossible, pockets of warmth radiating from below like breath from some sleeping giant. The sonar painted chaotic images on her screen, massive structures that defied geological explanation, too geometric to be natural, too ancient to be human. "There," Kael whispered, pointing into the darkness. "Do you see it?" At first, Sarah saw nothing but the familiar emptiness of the deep ocean. Then, as her eyes adjusted and the submersible's light swept across the seafloor, she gasped. Rising from the sediment like the ribs of some colossal beast were curved structures of black stone, each one easily the size of a skyscraper. Bioluminescent patterns pulsed along their surfaces in slow rhythmic waves. "Oh my God," she breathed. "What is this place?" "The first city," Kael replied. "Built when your ancestors were still learning to make fire. The depths have been sleeping here for millennia, but the awakening has begun." Sarah's scientific mind reeled as she tried to process what she was seeing. The structures weren't built. They were grown, composed of some material that seemed part mineral, part organic. Massive tentacles, each one thick as subway tunnels, writhed slowly in the current around the city's base. As they watched, one of the appendages brushed against the submersible's hull with surprising gentleness. "Are they alive?" Sarah asked. "Everything here is alive," Kael said grimly. "The city, the depths, the ocean itself in this place. They are all one organism, dreaming the long dream of ages, but the dream is ending." "No," Kael said sharply, "we must go deeper, to the heart chamber." Sarah looked at him uncertainly. Every instinct screamed that they were in terrible danger, yet the scientist in her burned to understand what they had discovered. "What's in the heart chamber?" "The reason my people have guarded these waters for 10,000 years. The reason the British couldn't conquer our island. Why every ship that comes too close meets with storms and madness. We are the Watchers, the last guardians of a secret that could end your world." "This is what dreams beneath your feet," Kael said. "This is what stirs when the ancient songs grow weak. In 7 days, when the planetary alignment is complete, it will wake fully. And when it does, every ocean on Earth will become an extension of its will." Sarah stared at the impossible sight, understanding finally washing over her like a cold tide. They weren't just looking at an ancient ruin. They were inside a living organism of planetary scale, one that had been dreaming of reclaiming its world for eons. The submersible, Deep Echo, descended through layers of crushing darkness, its titanium hull groaning against the impossible pressure 3 miles beneath the Pacific surface. Sarah pressed her face to the porthole, watching bioluminescent creatures drift past like fallen stars, their alien beauty a stark contrast to the terror building in her chest. "Sonar's picking up massive structures dead ahead," Captain Morrison announced, his weathered hands steady on the controls despite the tremor in his voice. "Whatever's down there, it's big enough to have its own gravitational field." Kael sat motionless beside Sarah, his eyes closed in what she'd learned was a form of meditation passed down through countless generations of his people. The traditional Sentinelese markings on his skin seemed to pulse with their own inner light in the submersible's blue glow. "The architects built their greatest stronghold here," he said without opening his eyes. "Where the earth bleeds heat into the cold depths. They knew the sleepers would eventually break free from their prison beneath the ice." Dr. Martinez hunched over his instruments, frantically recording readings that defied every law of physics he'd spent his career studying. "The electromagnetic signatures are off the charts. Whatever's generating this energy has been dormant for millennia, but it's definitely waking up." Through the porthole, the first hints of impossible architecture began to emerge from the abyssal plain. Towers that spiraled upward in mathematical perfection, their surfaces covered in the same intricate symbols Sarah had seen carved into the ice caves of Antarctica. But these weren't ruins. They pulsed with an organic luminescence that spoke of technology beyond human comprehension. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. "It's a city. An entire goddamn city." The structures stretched beyond the reach of their lights, vast and alien, yet somehow familiar, as if glimpsed in half-remembered dreams. Massive conduits snaked between the buildings, carrying streams of energy that painted the water in shifting hues of gold and crimson. Kael finally opened his eyes, and Sarah saw an ancient sadness there that seemed far older than his apparent age. "My people have guarded this secret for 10,000 years, waiting for the signs that would herald their return. The melting ice, the strange songs from the deep, the lights in the sky that dance with unnatural colors." A low vibration thrummed through the submersible's hull, so deep it seemed to resonate in their bones. The city's lights pulsed brighter in response, and Sarah realized with growing horror that they weren't observing a dead ruin. They were watching something massive beginning to stir. "The quantum distortions are intensifying," Martinez reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "The readings suggest we're looking at technology that manipulates space-time itself. This is how they moved between worlds, between dimensions. Morrison fought to maintain control as invisible currents began buffeting the submersible. If we're going to do whatever the hell we came down here to do, we better do it fast. The water's getting angry. The resonance key, he explained, noting her recognition. The last gift the architects left behind before they fled to the spaces between stars. It can either complete the awakening or seal the sleepers for another age. The city below them suddenly blazed with blinding light, and through the water came a sound that human ears were never meant to hear, a harmony of voices singing in frequencies that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the primitive terror centers of the brain. "They know we're here," Kael said simply. "The sleepers can sense the key's presence. They remember what it cost them before." Sarah's hands shook as she watched tentacles the size of subway cars emerge from caverns between the buildings, followed by shapes that defied description, geometric impossibilities that her mind kept trying to categorize as machinery until she realized with sick certainty that they were alive. "The choice is yours, Dr. Chen," Kael said, holding out the crystalline device. "Your people brought this catastrophe upon themselves with their deep drilling and their electromagnetic experiments. But the architects foresaw that this day would come. They left the means to stop it, if humanity proves worthy." The submersible lurched as something immense passed beneath them, and through the porthole Sarah glimpsed an eye the size of a house, pupil dilating as it focused on their tiny craft with an intelligence that predated human civilization. Above them, the first of the ancient towers began its inexorable rise toward the surface, carrying with it the promise of an end to the world as humanity knew it. Sarah reached for the key, knowing that whatever choice she made in the next few minutes would determine whether her species had a future, or whether they would join the countless civilizations that had tried and failed to contain the things that dwelt in the deep places of the earth. The submarine and Nereid descended through crushing darkness toward coordinates that shouldn't exist on any map. Sarah's hands trembled as she monitored the sonar readings, watching impossible structures emerge from the static. Beside her, Kael stood motionless, his weathered face illuminated by the green glow of the instruments. 2,000 meters, reported Lieutenant Torres from the pilot's seat. "Bottom should be another 800 meters down, but I'm getting massive returns at 1,500. Sarah leaned forward, studying the sonar display. The shapes rising from the ocean floor defied explanation, geometric patterns too regular for nature, too vast for human construction, spires twisted upward like frozen tornadoes, connected by bridges that spanned impossible distances. "The sleepers built this," Kael whispered, "before the waters rose, before we forgot." Dr. Martinez, who had insisted on joining the expedition despite his injuries, adjusted the external cameras. "I'm not reading any current technology down there. No electromagnetic signatures, no radiation. Whatever this is, it's been dormant for a very long time." The first visual contact took Sarah's breath away. Through the submarine's porthole, bioluminescent patterns pulsed along the ancient structures like a slow heartbeat. The architecture seemed to flow rather than stand, as if the builders had shaped water itself into stone. There, Kael pointed to a massive circular opening in what appeared to be the central spire. "The threshold. We must reach it before they fully wake." As if responding to his words, the entire city suddenly blazed with light. Sarah shielded her eyes as columns of energy shot upward through the water, creating pillar-like distortions that made the ocean itself seem to bend and twist. "Jesus Christ," Torres muttered. "Whatever's down there just went active. I'm reading massive energy discharges." The submarine shuddered as something immense moved in the depths below. Through the sonar, Sarah watched with growing horror as sections of the city began to separate and rise. Not buildings, creatures. The structures had been camouflage, shells covering vast forms that now stirred to life after millennia of slumber. "They know we're here," Kael said grimly. "The first awakening has begun." A tendril the size of a subway train swept past the porthole, covered in the same geometric patterns they'd seen on the structures. Sarah realized with nauseating clarity that the patterns weren't decorative. They were organs, neural networks spanning the creature's impossible body. "Take us down faster," she ordered. "If Kael's right about that threshold, it's our only chance." Torres pushed the engines to their limit, diving toward the central spire as more creatures awakened around them. The water filled with a subsonic vibration that Sarah felt in her bones, a call that seemed to reach across vast distances. "They're summoning the others," Kael explained, his voice tight with urgency. "Every sleeper in every ocean. The old agreements are broken. The barriers are failing." Through the sonar, Sarah watched new contacts appearing at the edge of their range, massive forms rising from trenches and abyssal plains across the Pacific. The scope of what they faced began to sink in. This wasn't an isolated threat. This was a planetary awakening. The submarine suddenly lurched as something struck them from below. Torres fought for control as warning lights flashed across the console. "Hull integrity holding, but whatever hit us is still down there." Another impact, more violent than the first. Sarah was thrown against the bulkhead as sparks erupted from an electrical panel. Through the chaos, she heard Kael speaking in the same ancient language he'd used in the caverns beneath North Sentinel Island. The attacks stopped. "What did you tell them?" Sarah gasped, pulling herself upright. "A truth they remember, that one still walks among the forgotten who remembers the old words." Kael's expression was grim. "It will not hold them long. My people's authority weakened with each generation that chose isolation over vigilance." They were close now. The circular threshold loomed ahead, easily large enough to accommodate their submarine. As they approached, Sarah saw that the opening was lined with the same crystalline formations they'd discovered in the island caverns, the same material that had allowed impossible preservation and transmission of knowledge across vast spans of time. "The memory core," Martinez breathed, understanding flooding his features. "It's not just a structure, it's a repository. Everything about them, about us, about what happened before." Sarah made the connection, and the key to stopping them. "Not stopping," Kael corrected, reminding. "The sleepers were not always our enemies. The ancient compact was broken by fear and forgetting, but memory can be restored if one is willing to pay the price." The submarine crossed the threshold, entering a vast chamber filled with swirling energies and impossible geometries. At its center stood a pillar of pure light, pulsing with the rhythm of a planetary heartbeat. "The price of memory," Kael whispered. "To save humanity, one must surrender their humanity. The Guardian's burden passed down through my bloodline for 10,000 years." Sarah realized with growing dread what he intended to do. The Leviathan's massive form blotted out what little light filtered down from the surface, its bioluminescent organs pulsing in hypnotic patterns that seemed to reach directly into Sarah's mind. She felt her consciousness fragmenting, pulled between her own thoughts and something vast and alien that had slumbered in the deepest trenches for millennia. "Don't look directly at the lights." Kael's voice cut through the mental fog, his hand gripping her shoulder. Even he seemed strained, his usual composure cracking as ancient memories that weren't quite his own flooded back. "It's trying to establish neural dominance." The submersible shuddered as tentacles the size of subway cars brushed against its hull. Through the reinforced viewport, Sarah could see rows upon rows of eyes opening along the creature's flanks, not the simple photoreceptors of deep-sea life, but complex organs that tracked their movement with unmistakable intelligence. "The resonance frequency," Dr. Martinez gasped from his position at the sonar array. "It's not just communicating, it's calling to others. The seismic readings are going off the charts. There are more of them rising." Sarah forced herself to focus on the data streaming across her screens, using the familiar rhythms of scientific analysis to anchor her mind against the Leviathan's psychic pull. The creature's bioelectric field was unlike anything in the fossil record, yet somehow her equipment was adapting, as if designed to interface with precisely this type of organism. "The neural pathway inhibitors," she said suddenly, remembering the strange modifications Admiral Hayes's team had made to their research equipment. They weren't meant to study the creature. They were meant to protect us from it. Hayes knew, Captain Morrison said grimly, his hands steady on the controls despite the chaos surrounding them. That's why he wanted you specifically. Your grandmother's research wasn't just theoretical. She encountered one of these things before. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her grandmother's obsession with deep-sea acoustics, the classified project she'd worked on in the 1960s, the strange symbols in her personal notes that had never made sense. It all connected to this moment, this creature that defied every law of evolutionary biology. The Leviathan song cut him off, a deep thrumming that made the submersible's hull ring like a struck bell. Sarah felt it in her bones, in her blood, a frequency that seemed to unlock chambers of her mind she'd never known existed. Images flashed before her eyes, vast cities beneath the waves, a civilization that had flourished when humanity's ancestors were still learning to make fire. The Watchers, she whispered, the name coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. They're not just guardians, they're survivors. Around them, the ocean began to change. What Sarah had initially taken for natural rock formations revealed themselves as architectural remnants, their surfaces carved with the same symbols that had appeared on the Sentinelese artifacts. Bioluminescent organisms that weren't quite plants or animals pulsed in synchronized patterns, forming a vast network of communication that stretched beyond the range of their instruments. Multiple contacts rising from the abyssal plane, Martinez reported, his voice tight with barely controlled terror. Estimated size? Jesus! Some of these things are over 500 meters long. The water around them came alive with movement as more leviathans emerged from the depths. Each was subtly different, adapted to their specific environment, but all bore the same unmistakable signs of intelligence. They moved with purpose, arranging themselves in a formation that spoke of coordination beyond mere instinct. They're not attacking, Sarah realized. They're investigating us. Kael nodded grimly. The ancient compact held that humans would remain on the surface and the Watchers would guard the deep places. But the barriers are failing. The thermal vents, the changing ocean chemistry, it's forcing them up. Then why the warning? Morrison asked. If they're just trying to survive like any other species. Because we're not the only ones stirring, Kael said. The Watchers aren't the apex predators down here. They're the prison guards. As if summoned by his words, the sonar array exploded with new contacts. Something vast was moving far below them, something that made even the Leviathan seem small by comparison. The temperature readings, spiked as superheated water, began rising from trenches that the maps claimed didn't exist. Sarah's hands flew over her controls, trying to process data that challenged everything she thought she knew about marine biology. Whatever was rising from the deepest places of the ocean had been sleeping since before recorded history, and its awakening was triggering a cascade of responses throughout the entire ecosystem. "We need to surface," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was too late. The water above them darkened as massive shapes blocked their ascent, and the ancient song of the deep grew stronger, pulling them down into secrets that had been hidden since the dawn of civilization. The ocean floor trembled beneath them as Sarah's submersible descended through the crushing darkness toward the awakening Leviathan. Through the reinforced viewports, bioluminescent tendrils writhed upward like cosmic fingers, each one thicker than a subway tunnel. The creature's song reverberated through the water, a sound that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in their bones. "Depth, 11,000 meters and descending," Marcus announced, his voice tight with concentration as he piloted their craft through the maze of rising appendages. "Hull integrity holding, but the pressure readings are off the charts." Kael pressed his palm against the curved wall of the submersible, his eyes closed in concentration. "It knows we're here. The Leviathan remembers the old compact, but centuries of slumber have clouded its understanding. It sees only surface dwellers, the destroyers who poisoned its realm." Sarah watched the sonar display as the creature's true form materialized in the green glow. The readings defied comprehension. A biomass the size of Manhattan with neural networks that pulsed with alien intelligence. This was no mere sea monster from humanity's nightmares, but something far older and more sophisticated. There, Kael pointed to a cluster of structures visible through the murk. The resonance chambers. My ancestors built them as communication nodes, ways to speak with the deep ones without words. Ancient spires jutted from the creature's carapace like coral growths, their surfaces covered in the same bioluminescent script that had marked the artifacts Sarah first discovered. As they approached, the symbols began to pulse in complex patterns, a language written in living light. "Dr. Chen," Marcus's voice cracked with strain, "whatever we're going to do, we need to do it fast. The surface fleet is reporting massive displacement waves. This thing is rising, and when it breaches..." Sarah didn't need him to finish. The Leviathan's emergence would trigger tsunamis that would devastate coastal cities across the Pacific. Millions would die in the first hour alone. But more terrifying still was the knowledge that this creature was only one of many sleeping in ocean trenches around the world. "Kael, how do we reach it? How do we make it understand?" The submersible shuddered as one of the Leviathan's sensory organs, a crystalline structure the size of a building, oriented toward them. Sarah felt a pressure in her skull, not painful but overwhelming, as if something vast and ancient was trying to squeeze itself into her consciousness. "It's attempting contact," she gasped, recognizing the sensation from her earlier encounters with the artifacts. "But the connection is too powerful. A human mind can't contain what it's trying to communicate." Kael nodded grimly. "Alone, no, but together with the resonance chambers to focus the link." He looked at both Sarah and Marcus. "You must trust me completely. Open your minds as I taught you, but do not try to comprehend what flows through. Let it pass through you like water through a net." The submersible settled into a docking port that formed around them with organic precision. Through the hull, Sarah could feel the Leviathan's attention focusing, its ancient consciousness pressing against the boundaries of their small vessel like an ocean against a dam. "Beginning neural interface," Kael announced, placing his hands on two glowing nodes that had emerged from the walls. "Dr. Chen, Dr. Rodriguez, join the circuit." Sarah hesitated for only a moment before grasping the offered connections. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Her consciousness suddenly expanded beyond the confines of her skull, flowing outward through living conduits older than civilization. She was the Leviathan, vast and patient, remembering the young species that had once swum in her protective shadow. She was Sarah Chen, daughter of two worlds, carrying the memories of a grandmother who had once sung to whales. She was Kael, keeper of forgotten truths, the last bridge between ancient covenants and a modern world that had forgotten its place in the greater web of existence. Through their joined consciousness, understanding flowed. The Leviathan's rage began to subside as it recognized in Sarah's memories not just the destructive force humanity had become, but also their capacity for growth, for learning, for choosing a different path. Images cascaded through the link, possible futures branching like coral formations. In some, the great creatures rose in judgment, reclaiming a poisoned world through tsunami and earthquake. In others, the old compact was renewed, with humanity taking its proper role as guardians rather than exploiters of the ocean realm. The choice hung suspended in the dark water around them, waiting for the decision that would determine the fate of two civilizations, separated by millions of years of evolution, but connected by the same blue world they called home. As the Leviathan song shifted from warning to question, Sarah knew their answer would echo through every trench and current, reaching the ears of sleeping giants across the globe.